Now, we have covered this topic before, but it's finally feeling like we're settling into maybe not post-pandemic yet, but at least a waning pandemic period, a waning pandemic world. We all went through this huge disruption together, and now we are collectively figuring out what the world of work is becoming. So from our perspective, we wanted to see if leadership has changed. Are leaders behaving differently now when compared to the period before the pandemic? We will keep it simple by focusing on 2 time periods. That carefree time in 2018 and 2019 when we had no idea what was coming, and now as we try to go back to normal, whatever that normal might be. So we're going to look at 2018 and 2019 and compare that to 2022 and 2023. We ran this research globally with over 11,000 leaders. And as you can see here, our sample represented a variety of demographic factors. It is important to note that the majority were at the department manager level or higher. So let's talk about where the data come from. We use the LEA 360, which is our multi-rater leadership assessment that is used around the world and has over 1 million total participants. Now, the first part of the LEA 360, which is made up of a self and an observer questionnaire, measures how much emphasis leaders place on 22 leadership behaviors. These are specific, observable, and neutral, right? So not good or bad. The idea is to describe the leader's behavior, how they're being perceived by themselves and by others. And both leaders and their observers respond to this part of the questionnaire. The second part of the assessment is different for self and observer. So observers rate leaders on 32 leadership competencies. These are subjective scores rating how effective the leader is at each of those 32 competencies. And for those of you who aren't using it yet, the results of this part of the assessment are available in the Leadership Impact Report. The self participants get, instead of that leadership impact questionnaire, they get to respond to 4 reflection items. And in those, they rate themselves on their self-confidence, growth mindset beliefs, authenticity, and sense of being perceived as an imposter or imposter syndrome. Now, these are great scores to discuss during coaching to dig deeper into a leader's mindset, their current context, and some potential challenges. The results of those are available in the facilitator printout that facilitators get. Now, the study that we're going to talk about today on the effects of the pandemic on leadership just focused on the first part of the LEA, the 22 leadership behaviors. And we were interested in knowing whether leaders are behaving differently in their eyes and in the eyes of their observers. The measures we used, again, were the 22 behaviors. And in terms of the analysis, it's a fairly simple analysis. We compared leadership during the 2 time periods, 2018 and 19, time period 1, and then the second time period, the waning pandemic, is 2022 and 2023. Participants were matched on management level, function, gender, and geographic area. And we do this to ensure as much as possible that any differences in the 2 time periods that we find are due to the pandemic and not these other factors. What that gives us is insight into whether leadership has changed since the start of the pandemic, and of course, insight into what actually changed between that period and now. So let's start with observers. Have observers perceived changes in leadership? And of course, I just kind of told you that they have, right? So yes, they have seen changes in leaders. What they're seeing, what observers are perceiving, is an increase in emphasis on deference to authority, right? Following rules, using senior leaders for guidance when making decisions, demonstrating loyalty to the organization, and so on. We're also seeing an increased emphasis on cooperation, being more accommodating, putting the team's interests first, being willing to compromise, sometimes potentially putting your own goals and objectives on a second stage. And then we're seeing a lower level of emphasis on dominant behaviors. So we're seeing less forceful and authoritative or competitive leadership. Okay. So these three changes that we found are in the eyes of observers. Now, when we look at the numbers, you can see median observer score profiles for leaders before the pandemic in blue, and now during the waning pandemic in green. The behaviors that changed in significant ways are highlighted here: dominant, cooperation, and authority. And the median score change is 5 for dominant and then 10 for cooperation and authority. So, these are pretty, especially with those 10s, some pretty big differences when you're looking at average score changes. Now, let's turn to the leaders themselves. So what are they perceiving? So they are perceiving changes in their own behaviors, but I will let you know the effect size for this was small, even though it was statistically significant. So but it is important to look at this. They are seeing themselves as emphasizing empathy a little more now than they were before the pandemic. Leaders now see themselves as more generous and kind, and generally showing a genuine interest in others and in forming strong bonds with others. One thing that I will point out, these are different sets of leaders. We didn't look at the same leaders at both time periods. Just right now, when we look at leaders' self-perceptions, leaders currently perceive themselves as higher on empathy than leaders did before the pandemic. So when we look at scores, median score profiles, we've got pre-pandemic in blue, waning pandemic in green here. The one behavior where we saw differences was empathy, and the median score change there was 10 points. So what does this mean? It seems like leadership is moving toward less forceful and competitive approaches. Leaders seem to be seen as more willing to accommodate, to compromise, and to help. And they're showing a greater reliance on the opinion of more senior leaders and organizational rules and practices. Now, while observers did not perceive changes in empathy, leaders now perceive themselves as more empathetic than leaders before the pandemic. And that might explain part of why we're seeing this approach to leadership that could be perceived as maybe a little softer, right? Less forceful, more helpful, and more deferent to organizational leadership. Now, these changes took 2 to 3 years under high levels of stress to the system. And even then, only 3 behaviors changed in the eyes of observers and 1 for self, right? We changed the medium through which we communicate and even the frequency with which we communicated, but the underlying behaviors and processes seem to have remained fairly stable, right? Aside from these 3, humans are nothing if not adaptable, and change doesn't happen easily. It takes time and external pressure to see change like this happen at a large scale. But that naturally leads to the question of whether this will persist. Is this tendency due to just that sustained sense of uncertainty, and if so, will we go back to where we were before? Only time will tell, and data, of course, will tell us. But I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts. So please, feel free to share those in the comments.